steady now.
Move that timber now. Watch the line.
All right, keep it steady, man.
We need more steel up here.
Keep moving. Watch the shoulder.
Tank coming through.
January 1945. The Northern Apennines. Before dawn, the mountains are silent until engines begin to breathe. Cold air clings to stone ridges and pine-covered slopes as low clouds drift through narrow passes. Snow lingers in shaded gullies. Infantrymen move carefully, boots scraping rock, rifles slung tight against their chests. Then the sound deepens. Not footsteps, not mules. Steel tracks bite into frozen earth. American tanks emerge where maps once showed only footpaths. Their silhouettes appear briefly through the mist, angular, deliberate, impossibly heavy for the ground beneath them. Exhaust fumes hang in the thin mountain air. Gun barrels swing slowly, searching ridgelines where German observers believed armor could never appear. The mountains were supposed to protect them. They always had. Miles away, reports begin to circulate through Axis intelligence channels. American armored units are operating at altitude. Tanks climbing grades once dismissed as impassable. Roads widened overnight by engineers. Switchbacks reinforced under fire. The impossible is now documented. In Tokyo, analysts studied translated summaries with quiet disbelief. Armored warfare was meant for plains and deserts, not mountains. Not here. Not like this. What Japanese commanders struggled to understand was not the machine itself, but the doctrine that carried it upward against gravity, against tradition, and against everything they believed modern war allowed. And that misunderstanding would echo far beyond these frozen ridges, into the very assumptions shaping the war ahead. By the time American tanks began climbing into the Italian mountains, the world had already been at war for more than 5 years. What unfolded in those frozen passes was not an isolated improvisation, but the product of accumulated experience, hard lessons learned across continents, climates, and catastrophes. In Europe, the war had entered a decisive phase. By late 1944, Nazi Germany was under relentless pressure from multiple directions. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east with overwhelming force. In the west, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed toward the German frontier. Yet one front remained stubbornly unresolved: the Italian peninsula. Italy had never been an easy theater of war. Stretching north to south, hemmed in by seas, and dominated by mountains, it was a defender's landscape. The Apennine Range ran like a jagged spine down the country's length, forcing any advancing army into narrow valleys, exposed roads, and predictable approaches. Every ridge offered observation. Every pass could be fortified. Every river became a delaying line. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July 1943 and on the Italian mainland that September, expectations were cautious. Italy was seen as a secondary front, intended to draw German forces away from France and the Eastern Front. Yet German commanders quickly recognized the terrain's potential. They transformed Italy into a grinding defensive battlefield, constructing successive fortified lines that bled Allied momentum mile by mile. By 1944, this defense had hardened into the Gothic Line, Germany's last major defensive barrier south of the Alps. Stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, it anchored itself in steep mountains, narrow passes, and high ground that favored infantry, artillery, and prepared positions. German planners believed the terrain itself was their greatest ally. Roads were few, slopes were steep, weather was unforgiving. Armor, they assumed, would be limited, predictable, and controllable. These assumptions were not unique to Germany. They reflected a broader pre-war consensus shared by many militaries, including Japan. Before and during the early years of the war, armor doctrine across much of the world emphasized mobility on open ground. Tanks were designed to exploit breakthroughs on plains, support infantry across rolling terrain, and maneuver in environments where speed and coordination mattered more than vertical movement. Mountain warfare, by contrast, belonged to infantry. Light units, pack animals, human endurance. Heavy armor was widely considered impractical, if not impossible, in such environments. Steep gradients strained engines. Narrow paths restricted movement. Bridges collapsed under weight. Fuel and ammunition resupply became logistical nightmares. In military academies and staff colleges, mountains were taught as natural anti-tank defenses. The Imperial Japanese Army held this belief strongly. Japan's own military experience reinforced it. Campaigns in China emphasized infantry maneuver, artillery support, and light armor used sparingly and cautiously. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, dense jungles and rugged terrain further marginalized tanks. Japanese armored forces remained limited in number, lightly protected, and doctrinally secondary to infantry operations. Japanese military planners did not ignore armor, but they never saw it as decisive in broken terrain. Mountains, especially, were regarded as domains of foot soldiers and willpower. This view shaped Japanese assessments of Allied capabilities. American industry was acknowledged. American numbers were feared, but American adaptability, particularly its willingness to push heavy equipment into hostile terrain, was underestimated. As 1944 turned into 1945, these assumptions began to collide with reality in Italy. American forces, facing stalled advances and rising casualties, confronted a brutal truth. Traditional approaches were failing. Infantry assaults alone could not crack deeply entrenched German positions. Artillery could soften defenses, but not seize ground. Air power was often neutralized by weather and terrain. The mountains demanded a different answer. That answer would come not from abandoning armor, but from redefining its role entirely, challenging doctrines held not only by the enemy, but by distant observers watching closely from across the world. And it was here, at the intersection of geography, doctrine, and desperation, that long-held beliefs began to fracture, setting the stage for a transformation few had anticipated. By the winter of 1944, the Italian campaign had become a test of endurance rather than speed. Allied commanders no longer spoke of rapid breakthroughs. They spoke of footholds, ridgelines, and attrition measured in yards. Snow, rain, and mud reshaped the battlefield daily. Roads collapsed under constant use. Rivers swelled without warning. Every advance required engineering before it required courage. The German defense in Italy was designed around this reality. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood the terrain better than any map could convey. Rather than defending cities, he defended geography. High ground was prioritized over population centers. Infantry divisions were positioned along ridge lines where observation and interlocking fire could dominate valleys below. Artillery was registered in advance on every likely approach. Withdrawal routes were prepared even before positions were occupied. Crucially, German defenses assumed limitations on Allied armor. Tanks, they believed, would remain tied to valleys and main roads. Narrow passes could be blocked by demolitions. Bridges could be destroyed. Slopes could be mined. Even when tanks appeared, they would do so predictably, channelized into kill zones where anti-tank guns waited. Japanese military observers studying the European war largely agreed with these assessments. Through attaches, intelligence summaries, and translated German reports, Japanese analysts formed a picture of the Italian front as a slow, infantry-heavy struggle. Mountains confirmed what Japanese doctrine already taught. Heavy armor had no place there. If tanks appear at all, they would be rare, vulnerable, and dependent. What these analyses failed to account for was the evolving nature of American military thinking. The United States Army that fought in Italy in 1945 was not the same force that had entered the war in 1941. It had absorbed lessons from North Africa, where mobility and combined arms proved decisive. It had learned from the hedgerows of Normandy, where tanks were modified in the field to meet unexpected obstacles. It had learned repeatedly that doctrine was only useful if it bent under pressure. American commanders in Italy faced an unpalatable choice: continue frontal infantry assaults into fortified mountain positions, or find a way to bring firepower forward in spite of the terrain. Tanks, for all their perceived limitations, offered something no other asset could: protected mobility and direct fire capable of suppressing entrenched defenders at close range. To make that possible, the battlefield itself had to be reshaped. Army engineers became as critical as infantry and armor. Under fire and in brutal weather, they widened mule tracks, reinforced mountain roads with timber and stone, and constructed makeshift bridges capable of carrying 30-ton vehicles. Switchbacks were carved into slopes once deemed unclimbable. Bulldozers worked at night to avoid enemy observation. In some sectors, tanks were moved only after days of preparation, each yard of ground negotiated before steel ever touched it. The tanks themselves were adapted in practice, if not design. Crews learned to operate at extreme angles, managing engines under strain and navigating narrow ledges where a single misjudgment meant destruction without enemy action. Speed gave way to patience. Coordination with infantry became intimate and constant. Tanks no longer led charges. They inched forward as mobile strongpoints, bringing their guns to bear where infantry alone could not survive. These developments did not go unnoticed. German reports began to reference unexpected armored appearances. Defensive plans built around vertical separation. Infantry above, tank below, started to fail. Positions assumed safe from direct fire were suddenly engaged head-on. Morale shifted as certainty dissolved. Far beyond the battlefield, Japanese analysts struggled to reconcile these developments with established belief. Their understanding of American warfare emphasized abundance, not ingenuity. Yet the evidence suggested something different: an army willing to spend time, labor, and resources to force armor into places where it did not belong. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. And as winter tightened its grip on the Apennines, the implications became unavoidable. If American tanks could climb mountains in Italy, then terrain alone could no longer be trusted as a defense anywhere. That realization would soon be examined from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, technological, and psychological, each revealing a different dimension of the same unsettling truth. The shock of American tanks in the mountains cannot be understood through a single lens. It unfolded simultaneously across human experience, tactical necessity, and technological reality. Each angle revealed a different truth, yet together they explained why this development unsettled not only German defenders, but distant Japanese commanders observing from afar. For the men inside the tanks, the mountains erased any illusion of invulnerability. Sherman crews were trained for speed and coordination, not vertical struggle. Inside the hull, the air was cold and damp. Engines labored constantly. Tracks slipped on stone and frozen mud. Every climb was a test of nerve. There were no wide maneuvers, no room to recover from mistakes. One misaligned turn could send a vehicle tumbling into ravines without a shot fired. Yet the psychological effect worked both ways. Infantrymen advancing alongside the tanks drew strength from their presence. The steel hulls absorbed machine gun fire that would have shredded exposed troops. The tanks' guns reached enemy positions dug into rock, collapsing bunkers and silencing fire that had pinned units down for days. In terrain where progress was measured in blood, the tanks became symbols of persistence: slow, vulnerable but relentless. For German defenders, the experience was disorienting. Positions chosen precisely because tanks could not reach them suddenly faced direct fire. Soldiers accustomed to watching valleys below now found themselves engaged from unexpected angles. The mountains, once allies, felt suddenly exposed. From a tactical perspective, American armor in the mountains represented a redefinition of battlefield geometry. Traditional doctrine divided terrain into zones. Armor below, infantry above. That separation allowed defenders to plan layered resistance. Anti-tank weapons covered roads. Infantry dominated slopes. Artillery blanketed approaches. American commanders deliberately collapsed those distinctions. Tanks were no longer confined to roads. They were integrated into infantry assaults as mobile fire platforms. Instead of advancing first, they followed engineers and infantry scouts, moving only when terrain was prepared and routes secured. Progress was slow, but it was continuous. This approach denied German defenders the predictability they relied upon. If tanks could appear anywhere infantry could reach, then no position was inherently safe. Defensive plans lost coherence. Resources were stretched thinner. Anti-tank guns had to be repositioned uphill. Mines intended for roads were wasted on slopes. Each adaptation weakened the defense somewhere else. Japanese analysts studying these reports recognized the danger immediately. Japanese defensive doctrine relied heavily on terrain-based assumptions, especially in mountainous regions and island interiors. If armor could negate elevation advantages, then entire defensive concepts were at risk. Technologically, the tanks themselves were not revolutionary. The M4 Sherman was not designed for mountain warfare. Its armor was moderate. Its engines strained under steep climbs. Its silhouette made concealment difficult. Yet its reliability, standardized components, and maintainability made sustained mountain operations possible. American logistics transformed technological limitation into operational advantage. Spare parts reached forward units despite weather and terrain. Recovery vehicles hauled damaged tanks from impossible locations. Fuel lines were extended deliberately, methodically. Where other armies accepted terrain-imposed limits, the Americans invested time to overcome them. Japanese observers noted this distinction carefully. Japan possessed tanks, but lacked the industrial depth and logistical flexibility to risk them in such conditions. The American advantage was not simply machinery. It was the system supporting it. To German commanders, the presence of tanks in the mountains signaled a dangerous evolution. It suggested that Allied forces were no longer constrained by environment. German reports began to reflect concern not about tank numbers, but about where they might appear next. For Japanese commanders, the implications were broader and more troubling. The Pacific theater was defined by rugged terrain, jungles, volcanic ridges, mountain interiors. Japanese strategy assumed that such landscapes neutralized enemy armor. Italy challenged that assumption directly. American tanks in the Apennines forced a re-evaluation. If an enemy could bring armor into mountains under European winter conditions, what might they attempt elsewhere with sufficient preparation? Finally, there was the psychological weight of inevitability. Tanks moved slowly in the mountains. They broke down. They required enormous effort to deploy. But they kept coming. Each appearance reinforced a simple message. Resistance would be answered with adaptation, not retreat. For soldiers on both sides, this realization mattered. It shifted morale. It altered expectations. And for observers thousands of miles away, it undermined confidence in doctrines built on limits rather than possibilities. As winter dragged on, these angles converged. Human endurance, tactical necessity, technological support, enemy perception, and psychological impact fused into a single lesson unfolding in real time. And that lesson was about to become impossible to ignore as events pushed toward a decisive turning point that would test every assumption made thus far. Beyond the immediate battlefield experience, the use of American tanks in mountainous terrain exposed deeper layers of leadership judgment, doctrinal rigidity, and moral consequence. These angles did not unfold in gunfire or engine noise alone. They revealed themselves in decisions made far from the front, and in assumptions that quietly collapsed under evidence. American leadership in Italy faced criticism long before success. The campaign was costly, slow, and unpopular compared to the dramatic advances in France. Yet senior commanders tolerated risk and delay in exchange for pressure. They allowed subordinate units flexibility, encouraging field improvisation rather than enforcing rigid adherence to manuals written for different wars. This leadership culture mattered. Tank commanders were not ordered blindly uphill. They were given objectives, resources, and time. Engineers were empowered. Infantry coordination was prioritized. Failures were absorbed and studied, not punished reflexively. This approach created space for adaptation, turning mountainous armor use from anomaly into method. Japanese military leadership, by contrast, emphasized doctrinal purity. Field improvisation existed, but within narrow bounds. Equipment was expected to conform to environment, not reshape it. The Italian evidence challenged this philosophy directly. It suggested that command culture, not just hardware, determined what was possible in war. Doctrine is meant to simplify complexity, but in Italy, simplification became vulnerability. German and Japanese doctrines both categorized terrain as permissive or restrictive. Mountains belonged firmly in the latter category. The American approach blurred those categories deliberately. By redefining tanks as supporting weapons rather than breakthrough tools, American forces sidestepped doctrinal traps. Armor became an extension of infantry firepower, not a separate arm demanding ideal conditions. This shift unsettled observers who still viewed tanks through pre-war lenses. Japanese planners, especially, noted the danger. Much of Japan's defensive planning relied on assumptions about enemy limitations. Italian reports indicated that such limitations were negotiable if an enemy was willing to pay the price. There was also a moral weight to this adaptation. Pushing tanks into mountains increased risk to crews. Losses occurred without combat. Mechanical failures stranded men under fire. Yet the alternative, repeated infantry assaults, cost even more lives. American commanders made a calculated decision. Machines could be replaced more easily than soldiers. This calculus was not universally admired, but it was effective. It reflected an industrialized approach to warfare that Japan, constrained by resources, could not easily replicate. Observing this imbalance deepened Japanese concern, not about courage or skill, but sustainability. By early 1945, Japanese intelligence summaries began to reflect unease. American forces were no longer predictable. Terrain no longer guaranteed defense. Mountains, jungles, and fortifications delayed, but did not stop methodical advance. Italy became a warning, not because of its scale, but because of what it revealed. If doctrine failed in one place, it could fail anywhere. As spring approached in the Apennines, the question was no longer whether tanks belonged in the mountains, but how far this redefinition of warfare would go when the moment of decision finally arrived. April 1945 arrived in northern Italy with a deceptive calm. Snow still clung to the highest ridges of the Apennines, but lower slopes had begun to thaw, turning narrow roads into ribbons of mud. Fog rolled through valleys in the early hours, lifting just enough by mid-morning to reveal the scars of months of fighting. For the Allied armies, this was the moment they had been preparing for since the previous autumn. Operation Grapeshot was about to begin. For months, American, British, and Commonwealth forces had studied the German defenses anchored along the Gothic Line's remnants. These were not continuous walls, but interlocking positions layered across ridges, villages, and mountain passes. German units were depleted, but still dangerous. They relied on terrain, experience, and the belief that Allied movement, especially armored movement, would remain constrained. That belief would be tested first and most violently in the mountains. Before the main assault, American engineers moved forward under darkness. Demolitions were cleared. Bridges were reinforced with timber and steel scavenged from ruined villages. Bulldozers carved new approaches into slopes previously dismissed as inaccessible. In some sectors, entire nights were spent reshaping a single switchback so that a tank could negotiate it without sliding into a ravine. When the attack began in earnest, it did not announce itself with dramatic breakthroughs. It unfolded with pressure, constant, methodical, and exhausting. Infantry advanced uphill against entrenched German positions, drawing fire and revealing strongpoints. Then, slowly, impossibly, tanks followed. Sherman tanks appeared on ridgelines where German observers had never expected to see them. Their presence was not sudden, it was earned. Each machine arrived after days of preparation and hours of careful movement. When they did, the effect was immediate. Direct fire tore into bunkers built to resist artillery, but not point-blank tank guns. Machine gun nests that had survived months of bombardment were silenced in minutes. German defenders attempted to respond. Anti-tank guns were hauled uphill by hand. Panzerfaust teams maneuvered through rocks and trees, waiting for close-range shots. Some succeeded. Tanks burned on narrow paths, their wrecks reminders of the cost. But for every tank lost, another moved forward. Recovery crews dragged damaged vehicles back under fire. Routes were repaired again and again. What changed during these days was not the tactical balance alone, but perception. German officers reported that no ground could be assumed safe. The vertical separation between infantry and armor had collapsed. Defensive depth shrank as positions once considered secure were suddenly untenable. Through intelligence channels, these reports reached Berlin and beyond. Japanese military analysts, following the European war closely despite their own desperate situation, studied the details with growing concern. This was not a single daring maneuver. It was a systematized method. Terrain was no longer dictating possibility. It was merely influencing cost. As Allied pressure increased, German resistance in the mountains began to fracture. Withdrawals became disorganized. Communication lines broke. Units abandoned positions not because they were destroyed, but because they were outflanked by forces they believed could not reach them. By mid-April, the breakthrough was undeniable. The mountains had been crossed not by speed, but by persistence. Tanks had become instruments of inevitability, climbing where doctrine said they should not exist. And in that moment, quiet, muddy, and relentlessly factual, the psychological center of gravity shifted. What had once been unthinkable was now routine. The question was no longer whether American tanks could fight in the mountains, but how this revelation would reshape the final phase of the war, both in Europe and in the calculations of those watching from afar. As April 1945 pressed forward, the consequences of the mountain breakthrough unfolded with accelerating momentum. The Allied advance no longer paused at ridgelines. Once the logic of terrain-based resistance collapsed, German defenses unraveled with surprising speed. The Apennines, which had delayed entire armies for months, could no longer contain them. American armored units, once carefully rationed to valleys and roads, now flowed through prepared mountain corridors into northern Italy's lowlands. The transition was swift, but not chaotic. Every movement had been rehearsed through weeks of incremental gains. When tanks descended from the mountains into the Po Valley approaches, they did so with confidence earned under far harsher conditions. German command recognized the danger too late. Orders to hold were issued without the means to enforce them. Units exhausted by mountain fighting lacked mobility. Fuel shortages crippled any hope of armored counterattack. The very terrain that had served as a shield now became a trap, channeling retreating forces into predictable routes targeted by Allied air power and artillery. Reports from the front became increasingly stark. German officers wrote of American tanks appearing where only infantry could go. Defensive maps no longer matched reality. Anti-tank weapons were insufficient, misplaced, or simply bypassed. The carefully constructed balance between ground, firepower, and manpower had broken down. For Japanese observers, this phase of the campaign carried its heaviest implications. Intelligence summaries emphasized not just the presence of tanks, but the process behind their use. The Americans had demonstrated a willingness to spend time, resources, and engineering effort to negate environmental advantages. This approach contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations of enemy impatience or over-reliance on speed. In Tokyo, the lesson was unsettling. Japanese strategy leaned heavily on the assumption that rugged terrain, mountains, jungles, volcanic interiors, could compensate for material inferiority. Italy suggested otherwise. Terrain delayed, but did not decide. Against an adversary with industrial depth and doctrinal flexibility, even mountains could be methodically conquered. As German resistance collapsed in northern Italy, the symbolic weight of the mountain campaign lingered. Victory had not been achieved through dramatic maneuvers or overwhelming surprise. It came through adaptation, through the refusal to accept inherited limits on how war could be fought. By the end of April, the Italian front ceased to be a major battlefield. German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2nd, 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final days. Yet the lessons drawn from these mountains traveled far beyond the Alps. They informed Allied confidence. They eroded enemy assumptions. And they stood as a quiet warning to any commander who believed geography alone could guarantee safety. With the guns falling silent in Italy, attention turned to consequences, measured not only in territory gained, but in doctrines challenged and assumptions shattered. The surrender of German forces in northern Italy on May 2nd, 1945, marked the end of one of the most grueling campaigns of the European theater. Yet the conclusion of hostilities did not erase the lessons forged in the Apennines, nor the shockwaves sent through military thought around the world. The Italian mountains, once considered a natural fortress, had been methodically breached by forces that refused to accept terrain as destiny. The consequences of this campaign extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, challenging doctrines, shattering assumptions, and reshaping the understanding of modern warfare. In physical and human terms, the Italian campaign had exacted a staggering toll. Allied forces comprising Americans, British, Canadians, and other Commonwealth units suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, both killed and wounded. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, rain-soaked trenches, and treacherous, mud-choked passes. Equipment often failed in the cold and the mud. Artillery pieces sank into frozen soil, trucks slid down narrow mountain tracks, and tanks faced mechanical breakdowns as engines labored uphill against gradients never designed for armored vehicles. For German defenders, the toll was equally severe. Exhausted units were constantly repositioned along ridges and valleys, and the attrition of months of warfare left morale fraying. Units abandoned positions once thought secure, often without direct confrontation, demonstrating the psychological weight of the relentless Allied pressure. Yet the Italian campaign was far more than a story of casualties and destruction. It became, in retrospect, a case study in the integration of human endurance, technological application, and tactical innovation. American armored units had entered the mountains in small numbers initially, testing the limits of feasibility. Sherman tanks, typically associated with open field maneuvers in France or North Africa, were transformed into versatile, mobile artillery platforms capable of supporting infantry in extreme terrain. Crews adapted to slow, careful advances, balancing engine stress, weight distribution, and terrain hazards. The progress was methodical. No single tank advanced recklessly. Every maneuver was calculated, rehearsed, and supported by engineers who cleared paths, reinforced roads, and constructed makeshift bridges capable of bearing 30-ton vehicles. The mountains themselves, long assumed impassable, were reshaped into arteries of advance, demonstrating that determination, preparation, and coordination could overcome seemingly insurmountable natural obstacles. For the soldiers on the ground, the effect of these armored advances was profound. Infantry units gained a renewed sense of confidence as tanks moved up steep slopes to suppress enemy fire. Positions once lethal to foot soldiers were rendered accessible, not because they were undefended, but because armored firepower could neutralize defenses while infantry followed. The psychological impact on German defenders was equally significant. Machine gun nests, bunkers, and fortified villages had been carefully chosen because terrain offered natural protection. Suddenly, tanks appeared where they were least expected, delivering crushing fire and eliminating the assumed sanctuary of elevation. German reports from the front describe officers and soldiers alike expressing disbelief at the presence of armor in places considered untouchable. Positions that had held for months collapsed within hours once tanks could reach them. The mountains, once allies, had become channels for inevitable advance. From a logistical perspective, the campaign highlighted the transformative power of industrial capacity and engineering ingenuity. American forces relied not solely on tanks, but on a system designed to keep them operational in extreme conditions. Spare parts were stockpiled and transported to forward positions despite narrow mountain passes and unpredictable weather. Recovery crews moved damaged vehicles under fire, sometimes employing improvised systems to pull tanks back from near vertical slopes. Fuel and ammunition were delivered along newly reinforced tracks. Each technical success reinforced tactical possibilities. Japan, whose military observers studied these developments closely, noted that such operations required not just machinery, but the logistical backbone of an industrialized nation. The contrast with Japanese capabilities in similarly rugged terrain, such as jungles or volcanic islands, was stark. Terrain could delay, but an enemy with organization, preparation, and patience could render it irrelevant. The campaign also produced a profound effect on doctrinal thinking. Traditional European and Japanese military theory had long treated mountains as natural barriers against mechanized forces. The belief that tanks could not operate effectively in such environments was widely accepted in both Axis and Allied strategic circles before 1944. In Italy, that belief was systematically challenged. By demonstrating that armored units could support sustained operations in extreme terrain, the Allies forced a re-evaluation of the rules of engagement. Mountains were no longer absolute protective barriers. Infantry, artillery, and armor could be integrated in ways previously thought impossible. American command manuals and after-action reports began to reflect these changes, emphasizing combined arms integration, engineer-supported mobility, and calculated risk over doctrinal rigidity. This doctrinal impact was mirrored in psychological and moral dimensions. The presence of tanks in the mountains altered the mindset of both attacker and defender. American infantry gained confidence, knowing that armored support could reach them in places once considered untouchable. German troops, conversely, experienced a sense of inevitability. Positions carefully fortified over months of preparation were exposed in ways that undermined confidence and cohesion. The collapse of morale in these final stages of the campaign was not always the result of direct combat. It was often the anticipation of forces appearing where none should logically exist. The realization that terrain could no longer guarantee safety had a cascading effect on decision-making, forcing withdrawals, abandoning strong points, and accelerating the breakdown of defensive organization. Japanese observers, studying these developments through intelligence reports and post-war analyses, drew their own strategic conclusions. Japan had long relied on terrain, mountains, jungles, islands to offset material inferiority. Defensive doctrine emphasized attrition, delay, and environmental advantage. Italian reports suggested that this calculus was flawed when facing an opponent capable of exploiting industrial depth, tactical innovation, and engineering flexibility. The principle was clear. With sufficient preparation and support, any terrain could be conquered. Mountains were merely obstacles to be overcome rather than barriers to success. For Japanese planners, this challenged not only assumptions about enemy capability, but also long-held beliefs about the nature of modern warfare. The strategic consequences of the Italian campaign extended beyond Italy itself. Once the Apennines were breached, the Po Valley opened, allowing Allied forces to advance rapidly into northern Italy and liberate key cities with minimal resistance. German attempts to establish secondary defensive lines failed due to exhaustion, logistical breakdown, and the psychological impact of seeing terrain advantages nullified. The campaign demonstrated that sustained, methodical pressure, augmented by adaptive use of technology, could collapse even the most carefully planned defenses. Allied victory in Italy, once considered slow and secondary, became a proof of concept for how armored, combined arms warfare could overcome natural obstacles and entrenched opposition alike. The aftermath of this success was meticulously documented. Reports, maps, photographs, and operational logs were compiled to preserve lessons learned. Infantry, armor, and engineering manuals were updated. Training emphasized adaptability, improvisation, and persistence. Future operations in Europe, and even planning for the Pacific theater, reflected the understanding that obstacles, whether mountains, jungles, or fortified islands, were no longer insurmountable if approached with preparation, coordination, and the application of overwhelming industrial resources. The Italian mountains, scarred and battered, stood silent, yet they had spoken volumes to those who would study them. They revealed the limits of doctrine, the power of integrated arms, and the central importance of preparation and adaptation. The costs had been high, both in lives and material, but the lessons endured. For German forces, the mountains had become a symbol of collapse. For Americans, a demonstration of ingenuity and determination. For Japanese observers, a cautionary tale about assumptions, adaptability, and the evolution of modern warfare. In the end, the mountains had been conquered not by brute force alone, but by the combination of human endurance, tactical innovation, technological application, and the relentless pressure of an army unwilling to accept natural limits. The aftermath of this campaign would resonate long after the guns fell silent, shaping post-war military thought, doctrine, and the very understanding of what terrain could and could not do to define the battlefield. The effects of the Italian campaign extended far beyond immediate battlefield results. While Section 1 explored the human, tactical, and logistical consequences of armored operations in mountainous terrain, Section 2 focuses on the strategic, doctrinal, and psychological aftermath, examining how the campaign reshaped military thinking, influenced adversaries, and reverberated across continents. By the spring of 1945, the Allied victory in northern Italy had effectively neutralized German resistance along the Gothic Line. Yet the implications were far deeper than territory gained. The campaign had demonstrated that terrain alone could not dictate outcomes in modern warfare. Mountains, which for centuries had acted as natural fortresses, could now be navigated, reshaped, and dominated with coordinated planning and industrial support. This insight fundamentally challenged preconceptions held by both Axis and Allied powers and would influence military thought long after the war ended. For the United States Army, the campaign validated a doctrine of adaptability that had been tested repeatedly in Europe and North Africa. Shermans and engineers, once considered ill-suited for rugged terrain, had proved their worth under careful integration and planning. Reports emphasized that armored units could function as mobile artillery, supply platforms, and morale anchors in environments previously thought impossible. The lessons learned were meticulously documented. Tactical manuals were revised to include mountain operations. Training exercises began to incorporate steep slopes, narrow passes, and coordinated infantry armor maneuvers under simulated adverse conditions. In effect, the Italian mountains had become a laboratory for operational innovation, proving that doctrine could be bent but not broken through disciplined, methodical execution. The German experience, conversely, revealed the fragility of doctrine when faced with adaptive opposition. Field commanders noted repeatedly in reports and post-war interrogations that terrain, previously relied upon as a force multiplier, offered no guarantee of defense. Positions fortified over months or years were rendered vulnerable by unexpected tank movement, and morale suffered as units realized that natural obstacles no longer provided certainty. The collapse of the Gothic line was as much psychological as it was material. Soldiers feared the inevitability of armored approaches from directions previously considered secure. Retreats, once orderly, became chaotic under the pressure of combined arms operations, and secondary defensive lines failed to materialize in time to slow the Allied advance. For Germany, the lesson was clear. Reliance on terrain without adaptation was insufficient in modern mechanized warfare. Japanese observers, too, found the campaign deeply instructive. Intelligence reports and post-war analyses highlighted the broader strategic implications. Japan had relied heavily on terrain as a force equalizer in Asia. Mountains, jungles, and fortified islands were central to defensive planning. The Italian experience demonstrated that a determined, industrially supported opponent could overcome environmental advantages through preparation, coordination, and technological integration. Japanese military thinkers noted that terrain could delay, but it could not decisively stop mechanized forces when combined with adaptive leadership, engineering support, and tactical patience. In effect, Italy became a cautionary tale. Assumptions about enemy limitations based on geography alone were dangerously unreliable. Strategically, the campaign also influenced post-war thinking on the use of combined arms in complex terrain. Allied commanders recognized that success in Italy had depended not on brute force, but on the meticulous orchestration of infantry, armor, artillery, and engineering assets. Tanks provided direct firepower, mobility, and psychological support. Engineers ensured routes remained navigable. Infantry secured terrain and suppressed defenders. Each element relied on the others, creating an operational synergy that rendered previously impassable terrain penetrable. This principle would later inform Cold War doctrines and the planning of amphibious and mountain operations, emphasizing integration and adaptability over static assumptions. The Italian campaign's aftermath also had profound implications for military morale and culture. For Allied soldiers, the success reinforced a belief in the value of ingenuity, persistence, and disciplined adaptation. Crews and infantrymen alike internalized the lesson that no obstacle was absolute if approached methodically. For German soldiers and commanders, the effect was more insidious. The inability to secure terrain that had once been considered a natural barrier undermined confidence. Retreats were accompanied by frustration and self-doubt, eroding cohesion and hastening collapse. These psychological dimensions were as crucial as the physical destruction wrought by firepower. When doctrine failed to match reality, uncertainty became a weapon in itself. In Tokyo and other Axis command centers, Italian reports sparked intense debate. Pre-war Japanese doctrine had emphasized a clear separation of terrain types: plains for armor, mountains for infantry. Observing American tanks maneuver through steep passes, supported by engineering teams and logistical planning, forced a reconsideration of these assumptions. Analysts concluded that industrial capacity, rather than tactical brilliance alone, enabled this operational flexibility. In environments where Japan's resources were constrained, similar operations would have been far riskier. This realization influenced Japanese defensive planning for the Pacific, though it was often too late to implement meaningful changes. The campaign also illuminated the importance of preparation, persistence, and incremental progress in overcoming natural obstacles. American forces did not charge headlong into the mountains with reckless abandon. Every advance was preceded by reconnaissance, route preparation, and engineering support. Tanks moved deliberately, occasionally pausing to allow infantry to secure flanks and clear obstacles. Roads were reinforced, bridges improvised, and alternative paths identified. This methodical approach transformed the impossible into the achievable, demonstrating a level of operational patience that contrasted sharply with Axis expectations of speed and attrition. In operational terms, the aftermath of the Italian campaign validated the concept of engineered mobility, the deliberate reshaping of terrain to permit mechanized operations where they had previously been infeasible. Bulldozers, engineers, and labor teams became as critical to success as artillery or tanks. Every switchback, every reinforced bridge, every cleared minefield represented a tactical innovation with strategic consequences. Military observers, including Japanese intelligence officers, recognized that success in such environments required an integration of manpower, machinery, and planning, a lesson with implications far beyond the Italian front. Finally, the human dimension of the aftermath cannot be understated. Soldiers remembered the struggle vividly: the slow climbs, the freezing temperatures, the tension of moving armored vehicles along narrow ledges with ravines on either side. Survivors recounted moments of fear and ingenuity, of exhaustion overcome by discipline, and of the profound sense of inevitability when combined arms advanced relentlessly. For commanders, the campaign underscored that leadership, flexibility, and calculated risk were decisive factors, sometimes more so than raw firepower. These lessons informed training, doctrine, and the culture of armies well into the post-war period. By the time the final German units in northern Italy surrendered, the campaign had reshaped not just territory, but thought itself. Mountains, once inviolable, had been traversed. Defensive doctrine, long grounded in environmental certainty, had been challenged. Observers worldwide, particularly in Japan, had witnessed an approach to warfare that married human endurance, engineering ingenuity, and technological capability in ways previously unimaginable. The Italian mountains became, symbolically, a proving ground for modern operational art, demonstrating that preparation, adaptability, and persistence could overcome even the most formidable natural obstacles. In retrospect, the Italian campaign's aftermath was as significant as its climax. It was a lesson in logistics, doctrine, psychology, and industrialized warfare. It illustrated that no terrain is absolute, no assumption beyond scrutiny, and no defense guaranteed. The mountains have been conquered not simply by tanks or infantry, but by an integrated approach that anticipated obstacles, adapted to conditions, and exploited every advantage at the Army's disposal. In broader historical terms, the campaign left a legacy of caution and inspiration. For the Allies, it became a blueprint for overcoming environmental challenges in future operations. For the Axis, and particularly for Japanese strategists, it served as a stark warning that assumptions about terrain and enemy limitations could no longer be relied upon. Italy had shown that the battlefield could be redefined, that doctrine could be bent, and that warfare was as much about adaptability and preparation as it was about numbers or firepower. The Apennines, scarred by artillery, traversed by tanks, and climbed by soldiers under freezing skies, became an enduring testament to this principle. In the quiet that followed the surrender, the mountains remained, unchanged in their form, but forever altered in their significance. They were no longer simply obstacles. They were instruments in a lesson that would shape military thought, strategic planning, and the understanding of modern warfare for generations. The Italian mountains had stood for centuries as silent witnesses to human struggle, their ridges and valleys shaping lives, villages, and armies. In 1945, they bore witness to something new, a collision between tradition and adaptation, between terrain and industrialized warfare, between expectation and reality. What had been considered a natural fortress was revealed instead as a testing ground for ingenuity, perseverance, and calculated risk. For the Allied armies, the campaign was proof that no obstacle was insurmountable when preparation and coordination met resolve. Infantry, armor, and engineers had moved as a single organism, transforming impossibility into achievement. The slow, deliberate climb of Sherman tanks up treacherous slopes became emblematic not only of tactical innovation, but of a mindset that refused to accept limits. Mountains did not dictate strategy, the army did. Each reinforced road, each improvised bridge, each inch of terrain gained represented the triumph of planning over assumption, persistence over ease, and adaptability over rigid doctrine. For the Axis, and particularly for Japanese observers, the lessons were sobering. Terrain could no longer be counted as an ally. Defensive doctrines grounded in the supposed immutability of mountains, jungles, or islands were revealed as provisional at best. The Italian experience demonstrated that a determined, industrially backed force could redefine the battlefield. Doctrine alone could not substitute for preparation, flexibility, and the integration of technology and manpower. Beyond the military calculus, the campaign left a human impression. Soldiers remembered fear and endurance, failure and improvisation, the strain of navigating impossible landscapes, and the relief of inching forward under relentless pressure. The mountains had tested human endurance as much as they tested machinery, and in doing so, revealed a truth at the heart of warfare. Adaptability is as decisive as strength, and ingenuity often outweighs expectation. In the quiet after victory, as snowmelt ran through ravines and ridges returned to silence, the mountains themselves seemed unchanged, but the lessons they carried had shifted the world. They reminded all who studied them that warfare is not determined by what seems natural, but by what human effort can achieve. And in that revelation lay the enduring legacy of the Italian campaign, that in war, as in life, the impossible can be made inevitable by those willing to challenge it.